Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. You know, the drill. We pick some super interesting reports and articles and we unpack them together.
That's right. The goal is to give you some food for thought and maybe even spark some debate around these really complex global issues.
Exactly. And today's deep dive is all about power shifts on the world stage.
Mhm.
Are we moving away from a US dominated world order? Are we headed towards a multipolar system with multiple power centers?
It's a question that a lot of folks were asking, and we're going to try to get to the bottom of it.
Our main source for this deep dive is an essay called Prospects for a Multipolar World Order by Rudolf G. Adam. And for those who might not know, Adam was a VP of Germany's Federal Intelligence Service. So he's got some serious insights into this stuff.
Yeah, he's definitely not just some armchair analyst. He's been in the thick of it, so his perspective is really valuable.
Absolutely. And right off the bat, Adam throws us a bit of a curveball.
Mhm.
He calls multipolarity an apparent oxymoron, which definitely made me scratch my head at first.
Yeah, it's a provocative statement for sure, but when you dig into his argument, it starts to make sense.
So help me unpack this. Why would he call multipolarity an oxymoron?
Well, he's basically saying that true multipolarity isn't just about having multiple powerful countries. It also requires all those countries to agree on some basic rules of the game, an international order that everyone's willing to play by.
So it's not just about who's powerful, but about whether they can all agree on how to use that power.
Exactly. Without that shared foundation, it's less about multipolarity and more about, well, potential chaos.
Right. So it's not just a matter of the U.S. declining and other powers rising. It's about whether anyone can actually fill that void and create a new stable order.
And whether all these different powers can find a way to coexist without constantly bumping heads.
Which makes me think about the U.S. They're still arguably the most powerful nation out there, at least for now. But even the essay acknowledges that there are some cracks in that seemingly invincible facade.
Yeah, Adam doesn't deny the U.S.'s strengths. They still have the most powerful military by far. They have a huge economy,
Yeah.
and their influence in tech finance and culture is massive.
I mean, look at the number of Nobel Prizes they've won. It's more than 3 times as many as the UK. And if you lump in the whole Anglo-Saxon world, the US, UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand.
They control a ridiculous portion of global output and military spending. It's really kind of mind-boggling.
Yeah, it puts into perspective just how dominant they've been. But you're right, the essay goes deeper than just listing the US's strengths. It also gets into these internal challenges they're facing, almost like a superpower having an identity crisis.
Exactly, and that's what Adam sees as their biggest vulnerability. It's not necessarily a rival superpower that's going to take them down. It's their own internal divisions.
He points to things like political gridlock, the debt ceiling crises, even the January 6th Capitol riot, as signs that the U.S. might be undermining itself from within.
And these internal struggles make it harder for them to project power and leadership on the world stage.
Which brings us to the rising giant in the room, China. The essay compares China's growth to Japan's trajectory, which is interesting because for a while people were predicting that Japan would be the next superpower.
Yeah, but China's rise has been on a whole other level. Their economic and technological growth has been phenomenal.
And they've been very strategic about how they've used that power to increase their influence around the world.
One thing that Adam highlights is their pragmatism. They're not really concerned with ideology or spreading democracy. They're focused on results.
Which makes them appealing to some developing nations who see the West as hypocritical or still carrying the baggage of colonialism.
They offer a different model of development and partnership, and that's attractive to a lot of countries.
So China's playing a long game, and they're playing it well, but the essay doesn't just paint a rosy picture of their rise. There are some pretty significant bets in there, too.
Oh, absolutely. They've got some major challenges ahead of them, starting with the big question of whether their economic growth is sustainable.
Some economists are wondering when it will peak, not if, and that could have huge implications for their global ambitions.
They're also facing some serious social and environmental problems. Pollution, water scarcity, a shrinking population.
Yeah, that shrinking population thing is a big one. Fewer young people means a smaller workforce, fewer soldiers, fewer people to drive innovation.
And then there's the soft power question. They haven't really been able to project their culture or ideology in the same way that the U.S. has.
So their global influence is mostly based on economic partnerships and infrastructure projects, not so much on cultural exports or spreading their political system.
It raises the question of whether you can be a true superpower without that kind of soft power influence. It's something they're going to have to figure out.
Okay, so we've got the US with all its power, but also its internal struggles. And then we've got China with its rapid rise, but also its looming challenges. It's a fascinating dynamic.
And it makes you wonder what role other countries are going to play in this emerging world order because it's not just a two-player game anymore.
Exactly. And that's what we're going to explore next time. We'll be diving into reports on India, Russia, the EU, and other key players who are trying to navigate this increasingly complex global landscape.
So be sure to tune in for part 2 where we'll unpack those reports and try to make sense of it all. Thinking about countries caught between those major powers, I was reminded of this report we looked at on Georgia's trajectory. From Revolution to Russian Influence by Stefan Hedlund. He's a professor of Russian studies at Uppsala University.
Oh, yeah, Georgia. That's a great example of a country trying to walk that tightrope. They want closer ties with the EU and NATO, but they're right on Russia's doorstep.
Exactly, and they've got that history of conflict with Russia, so it's a really delicate situation.
And Russia hasn't exactly been shy about using its influence to try and keep Georgia in their orbit.
Oh no, they've been using every tool in the arsenal: economic pressure, military posturing, disinformation campaigns, the whole 9 yards.
It really highlights how these global power struggles can play out in very concrete ways. For smaller nations, they often get caught in the crossfire.
Absolutely. It's not just about abstract geopolitical theories. It has real-world consequences for people's lives.
Their security, their economic opportunities, their very freedom. It's a high-stakes game.
And it makes me think about another report we looked at, Does Hope Spring Eternal by Lord David Alton of Liverpool.
Okay, that title is intriguing. I'm always up for a dose of hope, especially when we're talking about global politics.
Well, this essay is all about the role of hope as a catalyst for change.
So it's not just about wishful thinking, it's about action.
Exactly. Lord Alton argues that true hope isn't just about optimism or blind faith. It's about having the courage to act, even when faced with seemingly insurmountable obstacles.
I love that it's not about ignoring the problems, it's about finding the strength to confront them head on.
And what's really interesting is how he connects this idea of hope back to our conversation about global power.
Hmm.
He emphasizes the role of individuals and civil society in shaping a better future.
So it's not just about what governments or superpowers do, it's about the choices we all make every day.
Exactly. We have the power to make a difference, to push for change, to hold those in power accountable, even in a world that seems increasingly dominated by these big geopolitical forces.
It's a reminder that we're not just pawns in this game. We have agency. We have a voice.
And that brings us back to that thought-provoking question from the Multipolar World Order essay. If the universality of Western values can no longer be taken for granted, what new concepts of world order might emerge?
It's a question that makes you pause and really think about the future we're creating. What kind of world do we want to live in? What values will guide us?
It's not an easy question to answer, but it's an essential one.
Okay, so we've talked about the US-China, these kind of overarching trends. Let's zoom in a bit and talk about some specific regions that are being reshaped by these power dynamics.
Sounds good. Where do you want to start?
Let's start with the Middle East. We've got a report here called Netanyahu's Coalition to Face Post-War Calls for Elections by Robert Silverman. He's the editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Strategic Tribune.
Ah, yes. Israeli politics, always a roller coaster.
And it seems like the war in Ukraine has just added another layer of complexity to the mix.
The report suggests that Prime Minister Netanyahu's coalition might be facing some serious challenges in the aftermath of the war, with calls for new elections growing louder.
It's a great example of how seemingly distant global events can have a ripple effect on domestic politics.
Absolutely. The war has exacerbated existing tensions within Israeli society and put pressure on Netanyahu's government to respond in ways that might not please everyone.
It'll be interesting to see how this plays out, especially considering Israel's strategic importance in the Middle East and their close relationship with the U.S.
For sure, it's a situation to keep an eye on.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about Russia. We've got a report here called Russia's Labor Shortage is a double-edged sword for growth by Bob Savick. He's an expert on trade sanctions and regulations.
Oh, this is an interesting one. A labor shortage being good for growth. That sounds counterintuitive.
Right. How does that work?
Well, it's a classic case of unintended consequences, something we see a lot of in geopolitics.
So what are the unintended consequences in this case?
The report argues that Russia's labor shortage, which has been made worse by the war in Ukraine, is forcing businesses to become more efficient.
They have to adapt or die.
Yeah, exactly. They're investing in automation, streamlining processes, which could actually lead to a boost in productivity and innovation in the long run.
So it's like a forced modernization of the Russian economy.
In a way, yes, but it's not all positive. The labor shortage is also driving up wages, which could lead to inflation.
And some sectors are struggling to function properly without enough workers.
Right, so it's a mixed bag. There are both potential benefits and risks.
It's a high-stakes gamble for the Russian economy. They might come out stronger on the other side, but there's also the risk of things getting worse before they get better.
And that's a gamble they might not have a choice but to take.
Okay, let's move on to another region that's facing some serious challenges.
Hmm.
Moldova. We've got a report titled Moldova's European Aspirations Under Threat Again by Stefan Hedlund.
Ah, Moldova, another country caught between Russia and the West.
Yep. They've made it clear that they want to join the EU, but they're facing intense pressure from Russia, which still has troops stationed in the breakaway region of Transnistria.
It's like they're being pulled in two different directions.
On the one hand, they see the EU as a path to economic prosperity and security, but on the other hand, they have to deal with Russia's looming presence.
And the report highlights how this geopolitical tug-of-war is impacting everything from Moldova's internal politics to their economic development.
It's a reminder that the battle for influence isn't just about military might or economic power. It's also about shaping narratives, winning hearts and minds.
It's about soft power, and it's a battle that's being fought all over the world.
Okay, let's talk about sanctions. We often think of sanctions as a way to punish bad actors and force them to change their behavior, but one of the reports we looked at suggests that they can actually backfire.
Yeah, this report by Bob Savick, Circumventing Sanctions Through Innovation, argues that sanctions can sometimes have unintended consequences.
Like what?
Well, they can actually spur innovation as countries and businesses find creative ways to get around them.
So they're like a forcing function for ingenuity.
Exactly. They develop new technologies, new financial mechanisms, new trade routes. It's
Right.
like squeezing a balloon. You might block one path, but the air will find another way out.
So it's a constant game of cat and mouse between those imposing the sanctions and those trying to evade them.
Precisely. And the report gives some specific examples of how this is playing out on the ground, for instance. It talks about how Russia has been developing new financial networks and payment systems to bypass Western sanctions.
So it's not enough to just impose sanctions. You have to constantly adapt and anticipate how the target will respond.
It's a reminder that there are no easy solutions in geopolitics.
Okay, let's talk about another region that's often overlooked but strategically important, the Arctic. We've got a report here called Russia Clears the Path for China in the Arctic by Junhua Zhang. He's a senior associate at the European Institute for Asian Studies.
The Arctic, yeah, it's becoming increasingly important as climate change melts the ice and opens up new shipping routes and access to resources.
So like a whole new frontier is opening up and everyone wants a piece of the action.
And this report argues that Russia, which has significant territorial claims in the Arctic, is increasingly partnering with China to exploit these new opportunities.
So it's a strategic alliance in the making.
Exactly. And this partnership has the potential to reshape the geopolitical landscape of the Arctic, which has traditionally been dominated by Western powers.
It's a reminder that the global power balance is constantly shifting, and we need to pay attention to these emerging trends.
What happens in the Arctic or the Middle East, or any other region for that matter, can have implications for the entire world.
It's all connected, isn't it?
It is, and that's why it's so important to stay informed, to think critically, and to engage with the world around us.
Well said. Okay, before I move on to our final thoughts, I want to touch on one more region, the Western Balkans. We've got a report here called The Western Balkans, Overlooked but Not Unimportant by Klaus Wolfer. He's a former Austrian diplomat.
The Western Balkans, yeah, it's a region that's been through a lot in recent decades, but it doesn't always make headlines.
But as this report argues, it's a region with a complex history, ethnic tensions, simmering conflicts that could easily boil over.
And with several countries in the Western Balkans aspiring to join the EU and NATO, it puts them right in the middle of the power struggle between Russia and the West.
It's like a microcosm of the larger geopolitical forces we've been talking about.
Exactly, and it's a reminder that understanding global power dynamics requires us to pay attention to the seemingly small or overlooked regions as well.
Because what happens in the Western Balkans or any other part of the world can have ripple effects that are felt far beyond their borders.
It's all part of this interconnected global system. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've talked about the US, China, India, Russia, the EU. We've zoomed in on specific regions like the Middle East, the Arctic, the Western Balkans. It's a lot to process.
It is, but I think it's important to step back and try to synthesize all this information. What are the key takeaways? What does it all mean?
I think one of the biggest takeaways is that the world is becoming increasingly complex and unpredictable. The old paradigms of a unipolar or bipolar world order just don't seem to fit anymore.
We're seeing a diffusion of power. New actors are emerging.
Yeah.
Old alliances are being tested.
It's a very fluid situation.
And in this kind of environment, it's more important than ever to stay informed, to think critically, to be adaptable.
Because the only constant is change.
All right, so we've explored all these different reports, different regions, different players. It's been quite a journey.
It really has. We started by talking about multipolarity and whether that's even a realistic concept, and now it feels like we've gone down all these rabbit holes.
Yeah, but I think all those rabbit holes are connected. They all point to this bigger picture of a world that's becoming increasingly complex and fragmented.
And where power is becoming more diffuse and harder to pin down.
Exactly. It's not just about military strength or economic clout anymore. It's about soft power. It's about technology. It's about narratives. It's about values.
It's a multi-dimensional game now.
And I think that's what makes it so fascinating, but also so challenging to understand.
Yet, it's definitely not easy to wrap your head around it all, but I think that's why these deep dives are so important. We got to try to connect the dots.
Absolutely. And I think one of the biggest questions that keeps coming up for me is this: if we're really moving away from a U.S.-dominated world order, what comes next? I mean, is there even a possibility of a new stable order emerging?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And I don't think anyone has a definitive answer, but I think one of the things that Adam's essay really highlights is that it's not just about who's in charge. It's about what values and principles underpin that order.
Right, because for a long time, the so-called international order has been based on Western values. Democracy, human rights, free trade.
And those values have been challenged and, in some cases, undermined in recent years.
So if those values are no longer the glue that holds everything together, what takes their place? I mean, what's the new organizing principle for the world?
That's what we're all trying to figure out. And I think it's going to be a messy process. There's going to be a lot of experimentation, a lot of competition, a lot of conflict.
And I think that's where the listener comes in. It's not just about observing these changes from a distance. It's about actively engaging with them, trying to shape the future we want to see.
Exactly. I mean, if we just sit back and wait for someone else to create a new world order, we might not like what we get.
So what can we do? I mean, what are some concrete steps that individuals can take to make a difference?
Well, I think the first step is just to stay informed. Educate yourself about these issues. Read reports like the ones we've been discussing. Listen to podcasts like this one.
Yeah. The more you understand about the world, the better equipped you'll be to navigate it.
And then once you have that knowledge, you got to use it, speak up. Get involved in your community support organizations that are working to make a positive difference.
Hold your elected officials accountable. Make your voice heard.
And don't be afraid to think outside the box. Challenge the status quo, come up with new ideas, new solutions.
Because we need all the creativity and ingenuity we can get right now.
Absolutely. This is a time for bold thinking and bold action.
So to our listener, I want to leave you with this challenge. What kind of world do you want to live in, and what are you willing to do to make that world a reality?
Because the future is not preordained. It's being shaped right now by the choices we make.
So let's make those choices count.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.